What you need to understand about the continental trade collapse exploding across North American economic infrastructure right now is that when Canada formally abandoned the USMCA 6-year review process yesterday after Donald Trump issued his final ultimatum demanding complete Canadian subordination to American trade priorities, this wasn't just the end of a trade agreement. It was the announcement of the largest economic realignment in North American history, worth $700 billion annually in bilateral commerce. And the fact that global markets are now pricing in permanent trade fragmentation tells us everything we need to know about how systematically American trade policy has sabotaged the institutional foundations that made North American prosperity possible. The shockwaves rippling through global economic markets tonight aren't just about trade agreements or commercial frameworks, though both of those structures are becoming existential challenges to American economic leadership. They're about the sudden realization that the world's largest economy has allowed its diplomatic credibility to deteriorate so completely that it can no longer maintain basic trade relationships with its closest allies. And Canada has just demonstrated that institutional sovereignty can be weaponized with devastating effectiveness against even the most aggressive economic coercion. I've spent decades watching American institutional capacity operate through frameworks that assumed continental trade arrangements could be managed through American dominance with allied partnerships serving American strategic interests rather than mutual economic development. What we're seeing today represents the complete inversion of that framework, where American trade policy has become so dysfunctional that allied cooperation isn't accommodation anymore. It's leverage that American institutional incompetence has just made impossible to access. The USMCA crisis currently devastating American trade planning isn't just about review processes or continental agreements, though both of those mechanisms are catastrophic failures. It's about the end of American assumptions that trade is a unilateral policy domain that can be managed through allied compliance without regard for institutional sovereignty principles or international economic cooperation. And the market collapse spreading through North American commerce reveals just how completely those assumptions have collapsed. Let me walk you through what actually happened here, because the surface story completely misses the profound institutional dependency that this moment exposes for American trade policy. Once you understand why Trump was reduced to issuing ultimatums worth $700 billion in annual commerce to Canada, and why Canada's abandonment was so strategically devastating, you'll see why this decision may mark the beginning of a trade crisis that American institutions are fundamentally incapable of addressing. The official version sounds almost procedural until you examine the implications, facing the mandatory USMCA 6-year review scheduled for July 2026, escalating pressure from congressional Republicans demanding trade concessions that Canada had consistently refused, and growing isolation from alternative trade partnerships that could provide economic leverage. Trump delivered what his team called a continental trade realignment ultimatum to Canada. The framework would have required Canadian acceptance of permanent American oversight over Canadian trade policy, Canadian abandonment of all trade relationships that compete with American commercial interests, including the China Agreement, and Canadian subordination of economic sovereignty to American strategic preferences in exchange for continued access to American markets under modified USMCA terms. From Trump's perspective, this was American leadership solving an American crisis through institutional dominance. The logic was familiar. Canada depends on American market access for economic survival. So pressure applied correctly would secure trade subordination that American economic hegemony desperately needs without regard for Canadian institutional sovereignty. The problem with that logic is that it assumes Canadian economic policy exists primarily to serve American institutional problems rather than Canadian trade sovereignty objectives. It assumes Canadian commercial relationships are available for American cancellation regardless of Canadian economic priorities or institutional independence principles. And most catastrophically, it assumes that Canada has any obligation to sacrifice institutional sovereignty for American economic convenience. When Prime Minister Mark Carney was presented with Trump's ultimatum during an emergency cabinet meeting in Ottawa, his response was so institutionally confident that it immediately sent shockwaves through international trade and diplomatic communities. He didn't engage with the specifics of American strategic demands. He didn't offer modified terms or suggest alternative trade arrangements that might preserve USMCA access while accommodating American preferences. Instead, he announced that Canada was formally withdrawing from the USMCA review process and would begin immediate negotiations for alternative trade frameworks that prioritize Canadian economic sovereignty, institutional independence, and partnerships with countries that treat trade as mutual cooperation rather than subordination extraction. Then came the moment that triggered the market collapse and sent American trade policy into complete institutional meltdown. When asked whether Canada might reconsider if American demands were modified to be less intrusive, Carney delivered what may be the most devastating assessment in modern trade diplomacy. We choose dignity over dependency. The phrase "we choose dignity over dependency" has now been viewed over 200 million times in the past 12 hours. It's been translated into dozens of languages, analyzed by trade and institutional policy experts around the world, and turned into economic sovereignty messaging that every serious trade economy is studying for its implications about the future of American commercial credibility. But the viral moment wasn't just about trade policy. It was about the institutional sophistication that made such confident economic sovereignty possible. You don't abandon $700 billion in annual trade access unless you have $700 billion worth of superior economic alternatives, already operational and institutional capabilities that matter more than American market accommodation. And Canada had been building those alternatives for years while American attention was focused elsewhere. Canadian trade diversification, backed by government investment and institutional sovereignty principles, has been creating economic partnerships that global trading partners find more reliable and more beneficial than arrangements available through American trade systems constrained by ultimatum diplomacy and institutional dysfunction. Canadian economic infrastructure developed through partnerships with international trade institutions offers commercial solutions that allied nations find superior to American alternatives, constrained by dominance demands and unilateral requirements that prevent sustainable trade relationships. Canadian institutional research programs coordinated with international economic partnerships and trade sovereignty frameworks have been building commercial expertise that provides economic innovation through diversified partnership rather than extractive dominance optimization that prioritizes American convenience over global trade development. In other words, while American trade policy was focused on imposing institutional control rather than commercial competitiveness, Canada was building comprehensive economic partnerships based on trade sovereignty, institutionnelle innovation, and diversified commercial development. When that capacity matured, American dominance dependency became economically irrelevant. The immediate impact of Canada's withdrawal on American trade planning has been catastrophic in ways that most Americans are only beginning to understand. Commercial partnerships that American trade companies depend on suddenly face access restrictions and relationship limitations that threaten the institutional viability of systems that assumed reliable Canadian subordination would always be available through ultimatum pressure. American trade corporations that have been operating with reduced economic capacity discovered that Canadian alternatives they had been secretly depending on for institutional trade management were no longer available for American commercial expansion. Continental market access, supply chain coordination, and strategic trade integration all face relationship bottlenecks that Canadian cooperation have been quietly enabling. Trade infrastructure networks that developed around access to Canadian institutional compliance are contracting as Canadian economic resources redirect toward partnerships that provide sustainable commercial benefits rather than subordination accommodation for American trade incompetence. Regional economic systems that have been operating with the assumption that Canadian institutional backup would always be available are now facing trade limitations they cannot address through domestic relationships at commercial costs they can afford. The trade foundation that American economic activity was built upon has suddenly become unreliable, but the deeper crisis isn't operational, it's institutional. What Trump's USMCA ultimatum reveals is the extent to which American trade functionality has become dependent on Canadian subsidization of American institutional failures through below access to economic subordination that was never guaranteed as permanent policy. The institutional sophistication required to orchestrate this trade sovereignty strategy demonstrates something that American diplomatic planners have consistently underestimated about Canadian economic capacity. This wasn't a reactive decision triggered by specific American ultimatum demands. This was a proactive strategy designed to protect Canadian institutional investment while demonstrating the inadequacy of American trade crisis management. American intelligence services that failed to predict this USMCA realignment face uncomfortable questions about their ability to assess trade vulnerabilities created by domestic institutional dysfunction. When your analytical frameworks can't anticipate economic policy changes that affect America's entire continental trade strategy, your assessments of actual commercial security threats become questionable. The constitutional implications reflect the same institutional inadequacy that has characterized American responses to trade challenges throughout this crisis. When vital American economic advancement requires commercial services from allied institutional systems that possess their own democratic legitimacy and their own economic priorities, the constitutional framework encounters challenges it wasn't designed to address through traditional mechanisms. The current USMCA crisis can only be addressed through international cooperation with trade partners who no longer consider American institutional dysfunction their responsibility to solve. When those partners have developed superior alternatives to American economic partnership, constitutional tools designed to manage domestic challenges become irrelevant to international commercial problems. Canada's strategic genius becomes clear when you understand this moment as part of a comprehensive trade realignment designed to demonstrate Canadian economic sovereignty while maintaining access to global commercial development through partnerships that prioritize sustainable trade over subordination accommodation. The USMCA abandonment didn't just refuse American institutional assistance, it redefined the entire framework for continental economic cooperation. Instead of treating Canadian trade infrastructure as American crisis management backup, Carney positioned Canadian economic systems as superior alternatives that serve institutional sovereignty principles rather than dominant subordination requirements. This shift in framing has immediate practical consequences for every aspect of American trade planning: commercial access, economic coordination, trade capabilities, and institutional partnerships that American strategic companies have long assumed would remain available through allied cooperation are now subject to Canadian economic frameworks, where American institutional competence is a requirement rather than an assumption. International trade markets have noticed this continental realignment in ways that will constrain American options for decades. Economic institutions now factor Canadian trade independence into their assessments of North American commercial reliability. Trade investors price and reduced American leverage over continental economic cooperation. Commercial planners reflect increased risk premiums for American institutional programs that depend on continued Canadian accommodation. The broader demonstration effect extends far beyond North American trade relationships. When a middle power country can successfully abandon institutional arrangements with the world's largest economy through economic sovereignty, every other trade-capable country begins reconsidering its own relationship with American commercial cooperation requirements. European trade institutions have quietly begun exploring economic cooperation frameworks with countries that demonstrate institutional independence. Asian commercial firms have accelerated development of trade partnerships that don't require managing American dominance interference. This isn't anti-American trade policy. This is rational economic planning by countries that can no longer assume American institutional demands will remain commercially sustainable across electoral cycles. When your most reliable trade partner demonstrates that alternatives to American dominance crisis management are economically superior, everyone else starts exploring what they might be capable of. The domestic political consequences for American trade policy are particularly severe because economic communities most affected by Canadian partnership access termination provided the strongest support for dominance policies that promise to enhance American commercial competitiveness while undermining the international cooperation that makes trade development sustainable. From a strategic perspective, what's most troubling about this USMCA crisis isn't the immediate economic impact, though that impact will reshape American commercial competitiveness permanently. It's what this moment reveals about American institutional capacity to understand and respond to trade challenges that require international cooperation rather than dominance demands. When your approach to trade policy is to treat economic advancement as institutional domination rather than fundamental commercial infrastructure, you're not building competitive advantages. You're advertising trade dysfunction while pretending to demonstrate dominance leadership. And dysfunction becomes visible the moment international economic planning prioritizes institutional sovereignty over dominance accommodation. The economic sovereignty and institutional cooperation dimension adds another layer of strategic significance that American trade policy completely missed. Canadian economic systems don't just provide continental access. They demonstrate comprehensive trade leadership that includes the institutional sustainability and international cooperation necessary for long-term commercial infrastructure. Canadian investment in trade diversification, economic autonomy, and institutional sovereignty creates competitive advantages that translate directly into commercial partnerships. American trade systems constrained by dominance demands and ultimatum dysfunction fell behind in economic partnerships that matter to global commercial development. Looking forward, the most concerning aspect of this USMCA crisis isn't the immediate trade disruption, though that disruption will reshape American economic leadership permanently. It's what this moment reveals about American institutional incapacity to adapt to trade challenges that require international cooperation rather than dominance accommodation. When economic competitiveness becomes dependent on voluntary cooperation from trade partners who have developed alternatives to ultimatum-driven systems, American policy tools designed for dominance accommodation become counterproductive when applied to institutional partnerships. The more dominance demands America imposes, the more attractive economic independence alternatives become. Canada's USMCA strategy demonstrates exactly this dynamic in action. Every American ultimatum for institutional subordination provided additional justification for Canadian officials to develop trade independence programs. Every assumption of American economic dominance created incentives for Canadian commercial autonomy. The market collapse spreading through North American commerce tonight isn't just about trade, finance, or economic policy. It's about the recognition that institutional sovereignty has permanently shifted away from countries that treat continental trade as dominance extraction toward countries that treat economic development as cooperative commercial infrastructure. The path back to credible American trade leadership won't come through louder ultimatums for Canadian institutional subordination or more creative threats against economic sovereignty. It will come through rebuilding the institutional competence that makes American trade partnership cooperative rather than extractive. That means economic policies that prioritize commercial cooperation rather than dominance demands. It means trade investment that addresses international partnership directly rather than outsourcing economic responsibility to allied systems while demanding institutional subordination. It means commercial development that creates domestic trade capacity rather than depending on allied economic accommodation. Whether American political institutions can sustain that kind of fundamental trade reform remains to be seen. Until real reform happens, moments like this will keep repeating moments where American confidence in economic dominance collides with Canada's commitment to institutional sovereignty, and Washington is forced to confront a hard truth. Ultimatums are not a replacement for effective trade policy. The real decision facing American trade leaders is no longer whether to outcompete Canadian partnerships, because those partnerships are already active, already expanding, and already delivering commercial advantages that American systems can no longer reach through pressure-based strategies. The choice now is far more fundamental: either rebuild trade relationships around cooperation, credibility, and shared economic growth, or accept the lasting decline in competitive influence across global markets. History is clear on this point. Once major economic powers lose their advantages through coercion instead of collaboration, they rarely recover them. What makes this moment even more striking is that Canada managed this transition without sacrificing economic independence, highlighting just how deep the institutional failure on the American side has become. Trump's USMCA ultimatum was not simply a negotiation tactic. It was an unintended confession that American commerce now relies on enforcing compliance rather than competing through strength and innovation. Canada's withdrawal, in contrast,